Our next speaker, who will be handling the keynote address, is a man of many parts, a scholar, a researcher, a development expert. He's actually the director in charge of Africa and Middle East programs at the Johns Hopkins University. He's also an author. He has written a book titled Growing Apart: Politics and Economic Change in Indonesia and Nigeria. And so he's here. He's a brother. He loves Nigeria. Please join me as I welcome here Professor Peter Lewis.
Good morning. Morning. Thank you. Thanks for the kind introduction to the President, His Excellency Muhammadu Buhari, to the Vice President who is with us, Vice President Yemi Osinbajo, to the other excellencies, some of whom I count as friends, many of whom, all of whom I know by reputation, distinguished persons, conveners of the Nigeria Economic Summit Group, and honored ladies and gentlemen. I'm excited and I'm honored for the opportunity to talk to you today at the 24th meeting of the Nigerian Economic Summit Group to address the theme of poverty to prosperity, making governance and institutions work for the advancement of Nigeria. Nigeria's great potential and the country's progress over a number of years create the possibilities for a dramatic breakthrough to a more competitive and inclusive economy. But as we know, and as has been cited by the speakers who preceded me, Nigerians continue to struggle with profound challenges in bringing this vision forward. I have been deeply involved in Nigeria's and deeply interested in Nigeria's economic and political development for a number of years, long enough to have followed the first Nigerian Economic Summit in 1993. I had the privilege of meeting Pascal Dozier, who is with us today, Mohammed Hayatuddin, and Richard Kramer, who were inspired to help build this important forum on policy and governance. And over the years, the summit has become a center of dialogue and strategy for Nigeria. The current conveners and the attendees of this summit reflect the high caliber of engagement around Nigeria's development. It's well to remember that the Economic Summit in 1993, that first summit, faced daunting headwinds in the early days. Representatives of business and government discussed the enabling environment for economic progress, as it was called at the time, but they had to contend with poor governance and with economic stagnation. There was an adverse policy syndrome still in place and prevailing from a long number of years. There was widespread economic and political uncertainty, which burdened the economy. High levels of corruption shaped the public climate at that time, with little public accountability under autocratic dictatorial rule. Growth was lethargic, poverty was rising, and Nigeria was internationally isolated. Today, I would suggest that that discouraging picture that we saw in the 1990s is almost unrecognizable today, notwithstanding the challenges and the problems that have been cited. Nigeria currently has the largest economy in Africa, in excess of $425 billion. Between 2002 and 2015, the gross domestic product grew at an average rate of 8% overall, which yielded a very healthy rate of 5% per capita on average over that 13-year period. That pace of growth has enabled a doubling of average incomes in real terms since the inauguration of the Fourth Republic in 1999. Other positive features of the economic landscape should be observed. After decades of volatile petroleum dependence, we see signs of enterprise and possible diversification as never before. Finance, telecommunications, information technologies, media and entertainment, agriculture, and even manufacturing have shown signs of dynamism over the last decade. Urban clusters, notably Lagos, have caught the attention of domestic and international investors and cultural innovators as a hot location. In the recent recession, the non-oil GDP has often outperformed the petroleum GDP, and there are signs that oil and gas could diminish as a share of government revenue, though it still provides the overwhelming proportion. External reserves are gradually moving upward, currently above $40 billion, which, although it is well below the peak of about 10 years ago, is an unimaginable level if we think back to the 1990s, when external reserves were essentially zero, or $1 or $2 billion at most in various years. After a difficult period, the economy appears to be stabilizing and moving toward modest growth. These are real achievements. However, I know, and we all know, that very few of us in this audience will be comforted by the happy news. We know that Nigeria's economy remains far from the aspirations of its leaders, its elites, or its average citizens. Despite the improvements, there has not been a transition to a high-growth, sustained, diversified, competitive economy that can provide inclusive gains for the middle class, the urban poor, and the rural masses. With a poverty rate consistently above 60% and a rapidly growing population, more Nigerians are living at the margins. Unemployment has recently been estimated at 40%, and the forecast growth for this year is positive, but well below 3%. For all the changes that have registered across the Nigerian economy, the current recession basically mirrors petroleum markets, reflecting the familiar impact of cyclical policies over so many years. Manufacturing, which is the key to any economic transformation, remains below 10% of GDP. Neither government, as we have recently heard from Minister Udoma, nor the private sector, as we heard from the chairman, has been indifferent to these challenges. Indeed, many policy changes and institutional reforms have been pursued over the past decades with the intention of moving Nigeria to decisive economic change. But notwithstanding the great potential in resources that this country has, human capital, and I would add sheer talent and energy, Nigeria remains a nation persistently on the cusp, on the verge of development, of a developmental breakout, yet with an uncertain prospect of either moving forward to a breakout and making an economic transition or falling into the same inertia that we know. How do we understand these circumstances? What factors might propel the economy forward to shared growth? Nigeria's condition is not unique, either in Africa or in the world. Indeed, Nigeria can be compared with a number of other countries that have grappled with poor governance, with poverty and seeming economic stagnation, and seemingly static economies, yet they have made transitions to rapid growth, reduced poverty, and shared attainment. This group of countries that I would offer as a comparison includes other large states. It includes other ethnically diverse countries. It includes resource-rich economies. and countries with large Muslim populations. China, India, Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, Turkey, Mexico, Chile. These are some of the most prominent examples of countries that have moved from poverty, from stasis, to economic transitions and dynamism. There is no strong argument against Nigerian advancement, whether we look to history as our source, whether we look to culture as our source, or whether we look to structure. So the pessimists who say Nigeria can't move forward, can't break out in terms of development, are just wrong. They're wrong on history, they're wrong on culture, and they're wrong on structure. Like other countries, Nigeria struggles with the past, but faces open prospects if governance and policy can converge in the right direction. In my book, Growing Apart, Oil, Politics, and Economic Change in Indonesia and Nigeria, I focused on that close comparison that illustrates a path to shared growth. Why did I make this comparison? Both countries, Indonesia and Nigeria, are populous nations that stand as regional anchors. They are the most populous countries in their subregions. They are both ethnically and religiously diverse. They both have high levels of natural resources, especially oil and gas. They have been challenged each by histories of colonial rule. They had high levels of civil violence in the 1960s, and they were under military rule for more than 30 years. So the comparisons are somewhat remarkable in terms of their history and their background and their structure. But despite these important similarities, the two stories of development have been very, very different. From the late 1960s through the 1990s, Indonesia grew at about 7% on a consistent basis. It developed a diversified export economy that diminished its reliance on oil and gas, and Indonesia reduced poverty from more than 70%, as we will see in a moment, of the population to less than 15% in a very rapid period of time, and extreme poverty stands at less than 8% today. Nigeria, as we know all too well, has managed about half the level of growth. It has found it difficult to move beyond a sole reliance on petroleum, and the country has experienced persistently and discouragingly high rates of poverty. A couple of figures dramatically illustrate these different paths, and in these first slides, I've used the dominant color in each country's flag: red for Indonesia, green for Nigeria, an easy choice and one that clarifies the information. Here we go. So in 1965, the economies of Indonesia and Nigeria were almost the same size. Nigeria, with a smaller population, had a higher per capita income, as we will see in a minute. But as we see here, which is just the size of the two economies, there was a breakout period around 1982 as Indonesia experienced accelerated growth, which moved steadily upward, except for that blip in 1997, 98, which is the Asian economic contagion. But then they recovered and they continued upward. While Nigeria declined in the oil bust of the 1980s, as we know, and then stagnated for 2 decades. So that's been the growth story and the size of the economy. So we see a positive register of Nigeria's growth in the last decade or more, flattening out now, but lagging Indonesia. And then, there we go. And then we see per capita income. Demography also mattered. Indonesia was able to limit the growth of its population, which came down from about 2.7% to around 1% per annum. And so that allowed for more rapid increases in incomes. So we start out with Nigeria, as we see, with a higher per capita income than Indonesia. And this persisted from 1965, which is the first year that might be a little bit difficult to see here, to about 1982. But Indonesia moved from a lower base and moved steadily upward. And today, Indonesia's GDP per capita is about double that of Nigeria's. That was the case in 1997. The gap closed a bit because of the Asian financial contagion. Nigeria moved upward. The gap was closing a bit over the decade of the 2000s, but unfortunately we see a divergence again, with about $4,000 of per capita income in Indonesia and about $2,000 in Nigeria on a purchasing power parity basis. More importantly, or most importantly, rates of poverty have moved in different directions. So red for Indonesia, green for Nigeria. We see Indonesia going from 71% of the population at $1.90 a day purchasing power parity as recently as 1984, and then plummeting to below 8% today. In fact, I think it's below 7% today. And Nigeria, unfortunately, moved upward in the 90s, has subsided a bit, but the lowest levels, the extreme poverty, is still at about 50%, according to best statistics, and this is the National Bureau of Statistics as well as the World Bank. In addition, a key to shared growth in Indonesia and a key to poverty reduction, as we know from the previous remarks, has been diversification of the economy. With more people making good livelihoods in agriculture and manufacturing, people are able to raise their incomes. As we see here, Indonesia has diversified its exports. Fuel exports are in blue, and the orange or brown is manufacturing. So we see that fuel went way up in the 70s and the early 80s, and then went down as a proportion of exports and was overtaken by manufacturing. That's the simple takeaway here. By 1995, Indonesia was no longer a petro-state. It was no longer a petroleum economy. It was a diversified economy with petroleum. But it rested on three legs. It rested on manufacturing exports and manufacturing for domestic use. It rested on agriculture, both for domestic consumption and export, and natural resources. That could be the future of Nigeria. That should be the future of Nigeria. The record, as we know, has been the rise of petroleum in blue and the steady dominance of petroleum. You can't see the manufacturing contribution to exports here because it's almost nothing. There's a little bit of agriculture, and 97% is oil and gas. What accounts for this difference? The policy framework was markedly different for more than 3 decades. Indonesia focused on macroeconomic stability and competitiveness, while Nigeria frequently emphasized the politics of distribution and domestic patronage over growth. More important, however, were a series of institutional changes and features of governance that enabled Indonesia to pursue a successful development path. Many of these same features can be found in the experiences of Malaysia, of Vietnam, South Korea, China, Brazil, Mexico, and other countries. Some of them are Asian countries, some of them are communist countries, some of them are market countries. So it's not the labels, and it's not the region, it's the politics. I want to quickly set out 5 points that can furnish perspective on the current situation in Nigeria and hopefully provide this august body with some ideas about future strategy. And we can carry this conversation forward in the Vice President's panel, obviously, and in our plenary and other deliberations. Number one, in the cases of successful economic transition, a development-oriented leadership has driven change. Whether that leadership comes from a strong and committed executive or a forward-looking governing party, political guidance is an important element in managing economic change. Developmental leadership reflects important qualities. First, they hold a long time horizon. They look to the future, and they are willing to pursue an agenda that may be politically risky in the near term, but works toward longer-term gain. Think for a minute about China's Deng Xiaoping, Indonesia's Suharto, reformers in the PRI in Mexico, or the Communist Party of Vietnam. Not only did they not know whether they would succeed, some of them did not know whether they would come out of the process alive. But they had a vision for the country, they pursued that vision, and they were willing to chase it long-term and consistently to realize a vision. They delegated authority to an expert economic team that could oversee complex reforms over time. The economic bureaucracy could then focus on growth-enhancing changes while shutting out much of the political interference. And that is a critical element of developmental leadership. Not that they do it all themselves or that their own personality or energy carries the nation forward, although that is important. But they know how to put together institutions and staff and to empower them over a medium to long term to carry through these changes. Also, development-oriented leaders become accountable for economic performance. This becomes the basic social compact between developmental leaders and their citizenry. Number two, in cases of weak governance or deficient governance and weak institutions, modest changes produce significant growth effects. As others have pointed out, but as we should emphasize here, we must avoid the fallacy of assuming that all governance challenges should be resolved as a precondition for high growth and poverty reduction. As my colleague Francis Fukuyama likes to say, in the development community, there's often a fallacy of getting to Denmark. In other words, Denmark becomes the democratic, low corruption, good governance, wealthy, equal exemplar. That's the goal. And so everybody wants to get to Denmark. Well, there's a lot of middle ground between where we are here in Nigeria, where China was in 1980, where Indonesia was in 1970, and where they may be today. There's a lot of middle ground, and we don't have to get it all right at once. This is not a suggestion to relax our attention on governance or corruption, but to focus on some critical strategic changes that may move us forward very quickly. The essential conditions for growth, as we know, are macroeconomic stability and a generally predictable investment climate. Most recently, scholars like Lant Pritchett and Tim Kelsall and Sam Hickey have been focusing on the deals environment. In other words, if I'm making a deal, if I'm investing in a project or an enterprise, how easy it is to do the deal? How confident am I that that deal will move forward so that I can commit capital for 3, 5, 20 years? Credible commitments to property and contracts are often sufficient to generate large amounts of investment, especially by local producers. It's not all about foreign investment. Foreign investment can be strategically important, but there are millions of people in Nigeria holding capital today, some of it in banks, some of it under the mattresses, who could be enticed to bring that capital into investment in farms, in small and medium enterprises, in other manufacturing and agro-industrial concerns, if they had confidence that I can do this deal and it'll yield me an income for 5 years, 10 years, even to my children. These require some basic reforms and assurances, including strengthening a few peak economic institutions. Ministries, Minister Udoma is here, Minister of Finance is here. These are critical ministries in every developmental state that we see. Banks and some bank reassurances and confidence and stability, and a few regulatory agencies. Look what the Nigerian Communications Commission has done for communications in this country. Look what communications have done for the economy in this country. One agency, a few peak organizations can make a big difference. And a political commitment to the independence and the stability of business is important. What we heard today from government needs to be repeated again and again and again to give greater investor confidence. And many developmental governments, most developmental governments, send those signals regularly. China, Indonesia, Mexico, Brazil, Turkey did not necessarily eliminate corruption, perfect the rule of law, or secure property rights before they were able to generate business activity and capital formation. What they did was convincingly offer policy assurances to potential investors, both domestic and international. And the confidence, the stability of the investment, the climate, the deals environment unlocked massive economic potential. Again, not an injunction for complacency. Let's forget about, not a suggestion at all that we forget about corruption, that we forget about bad governance, that we forget about weak institutions. Those are ongoing projects. But it is to say a lot can be done now, and quickly that could get this country to 7% growth. Third, as Danny Roderick has suggested, and others, focus on the binding constraints. What needs to be done to move this economy forward? The chairman of the Economic Summit, the Minister of Budget and Planning have laid out a broad agenda. There are a lot of points in that agenda. What are the critical constraints? What are the main obstacles to growth and the priority of removing those obstacles? We might suggest that there are three in Nigeria. One, the electricity grid. I could almost say that's 2 and 3 also. If we liberated or solved the electricity and the power problem, imagine what kinds of economic forces could be liberated in this country. Look what already happened based on mobile technology and information and communications technologies. But power is number one. Roads and ports are number two, particularly feeder roads, rural roads, to get produce to the markets. And finally, the ease of capital transactions, moving money around. Nigeria can have an open capital account, it can have a controlled capital account. That's a policy decision for government and for Nigerians. Different governments have done it differently. Radical opening in Chile and an open capital account in Indonesia, partial controls in places like Malaysia. But the point is, you can move your money around. You can move it in and out, and you can do so with confidence. If more Nigerians had power, logistics, and fluid money, the economy could rapidly advance. Education has been mentioned. It's a medium-term goal, but it's also a critical factor, particularly closing the gender gap in education, as we have heard. Fourth, am I on? No, I didn't even get to 3. There we go. Oops. There we go. Oh, my number's messed up. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. This is the fourth one. Focus on livelihoods rather than jobs. We talk about 40% unemployment in Nigeria. Formal sector employment is much to be desired. But the fact is that about 8 in 10 Nigerians today work in agriculture or in urban services. Tailors, vulcanizers, rechargers, things of that sort. They're in the so-called informal sector. In a recent employment survey that was conducted by the World Bank, they found that just 3% of the Nigerian labor force has a regular formal sector job in the private sector. 3%. But we don't have 97% Nigerians who are destitute or unemployed. People are working. People have enterprises. People make investments, but they're not necessarily in the formal sector. If there's a deficit, I can't remember the numbers that have been put forward by the analysts here, but if there's a deficit of 30 or 40 million formal sector jobs, where do we start? You can't make that up, even under the best growth scenario. It should come later on, but for the time being, the question is one of livelihoods. China brought 600 million people from poverty to relative prosperity in the space of 25 years. And they did so by unleashing the energy of farmers, taking them out of communes, allowing them to have private property, enabling them to keep the profits from the sale of produce, and authorizing them to hire workers. All they did was to privatize some segment, not all of it, but some segment of the agricultural sector. And hundreds of millions of farmers suddenly started growing their own food, hiring people to help them out on the farm, and selling it in markets. They became wealthy. And when you have 600 million people who have a little bit of money, guess what? They start buying refrigerators. They start buying mattresses. They start buying bicycles and scooters. So then they could build domestic industries. First, they imported things from Korea and Japan. Then with that size market, they were able to build their own things and sustain their own industries. The opening of urban enterprises in China and in Vietnam greatly improved livelihoods. Indonesia and Mexico improved conditions for small enterprises. So if you think about where are people working today and how do we make it easier for them to do what they do and to keep their money and to invest and expand their businesses, that's where to start from. And it's important to think about formal sector jobs, but the formal sector jobs, manufacturing and services, they will follow. Electricity, logistics, and finance, we come back to the binding constraints, could massively improve the prospects for average Nigerians and enable millions of households to advance. Those same factors would encourage formal enterprise, especially manufacturing and agro-industry. So if you get the local barber or hairdresser off of a generator and onto the grid, let them bank their money and make it easier for them to get supplies and advertise and do whatever else they need to do. Those same factors are going to enable the large industries and the big investors to also prosper. Both of those things can happen. Last point. Let's see what number this one gives us. It also gives us number one. The final point focuses on sectorial strategies, especially industrial policy. A number of prominent development specialists today urge us to reconsider targeted sectorial policies to advance key sectors of the economy. This approach fell out of favor in the 1980s with the failure of import substituting industrialization schemes, which were heavily government-controlled, state-subsidized, and often patronage schemes. There's no recommendation here to bring back those programs, but there is a suggestion to think about sectorial strategies and strategic approaches to competitiveness, including an important degree of government support and government protection. The Minister of Budget and Planning talked about the labs approach. This is exactly the kinds of consultative schemes that can be beneficial in moving this type of agenda forward. Consultative groups among government and the private sector, not just general groups like this group or this forum, but really focused on industries, really focused on sectors or even subsectors, agro-industry, or metals and mining, or automobile manufacturing, or any other activity you can think of. They can focus on the needs of particular industries, particular areas of activity. And here, too, alliances between government and key producer groups can create a foundation of confidence and growth. In China, in Vietnam, Mexico, Indonesia, the government engaged with private sector groups and gave backing to key producers in the urban and the rural sectors, which fostered rapid and dramatic growth. Two quick agricultural examples illustrate this. In Indonesia, they created a logistics bureau, Bulog, which was solely focused on maintaining the price for rice. And of course, rice being the overwhelming staple in Indonesia and the overwhelming crop cash crop for farmers, maintaining that rice price, creating strategic reserves, maintaining the logistics needed to sustain rice production, that was critical. In Vietnam, in 1990, after the liberalization Doi Moi program, Vietnam basically did not produce any coffee. Coffee was not an Asian drink, and they had no presence in that market. They went from virtually no coffee production to being the #2 producer of coffee in the world today. If I asked this audience, who's the #2 producer of coffee in the world, before I told you that, you would come up with Brazil, you would come up with, you know, Cote d'Ivoire or Ethiopia or Kenya or any number of other countries. But Colombia remains #1 and Vietnam is #2. How did they go from nothing to second in the world in market share really in the space of about 15 years? They made a very strategic set of decisions about moving people into coffee production and then sustaining and supporting them with the logistics and the finance that they needed. And that's been the result. So, producer alliances. So to conclude my remarks, this is always the favorite sentence that everybody waits for in all of these speeches. Let me start very quickly with a couple of scenarios. Let's turn to the helpful image of scenarios. In one scenario, of course, there's a breakout to high growth. Nigeria builds upon recent policy changes that have been made really since the early 2000s, the mid-2000s, and some progress in institutional development, which is undeniable, utilizing vast human potential and the resource endowment to elevate the economy into a powerful emerging market. This is the path to inclusive growth and global attainment. There's an alternate path, and you know what I'm going to say. More familiar, hardly inevitable. This is not the path that I see for Nigeria. Despite serious thinking and policy innovation, the economy could remain stuck. Matt Andrews at Harvard University is very fond of talking about stuck countries and stuck economies. And we know that that happens, not just here. Despite good efforts, hard work, conscientious attention, somehow something doesn't break right. The economy could remain stuck in resource dependence and volatile growth with no breakout in non-oil segments of the economy. Wealth would remain highly concentrated, public finances could be opaque, and the prospects for ordinary Nigerians could be crowded. So how do we get the first scenario? How do we get to that? The right choices and the right strategies and the right priorities can make the first scenario a reality. The elements have been outlined here. An effective economic team led and protected and urged forward by a forward-looking leadership. Strengthening a few peak economic institutions. We want to get everything right eventually, but you can get a few things right now. Pursuing alliances with urban entrepreneurs and rural producers. Breaking through the critical bottlenecks in infrastructure, notably and probably foremost electricity. And creating a more predictable environment for transactions. This is an attainable list of factors that lie within the grasp of this gathering. Distinguished government leaders, distinguished members of the private sector. Ask anyone from Indonesia, from China, from Malaysia, or from Mexico if they think back 30 years, people of a certain age, if they thought 30 years ago that their economy would look like what it is today, in terms of wealth, in terms of industrialization, in terms of competitiveness. I visited China 30 years ago. Beijing was bicycles and 2-story buildings, 2 7 or 8 or 10-story buildings. Many people here have been to Beijing today, and you know what it's like. Each of these countries' critical strategic and political changes came together at a certain point to deliver rapid gains in development and a transformation of these economies. Many of the changes in these countries that are comparable to Nigeria have been astonishing. In conclusion, I look forward to being astonished by Nigeria. Thank you for your attention.